my name is Ashwini Zenooz. I am the lead for our healthcare life sciences business at Salesforce. I'm a medical doctor by training. I'm a radiologist. I think I heard someone say earlier they're a radiologist as well. I'm fairly new to corporate America. I started at Salesforce about 5 months ago. And I came from the Department of Veterans Affairs, where I was the chief medical officer overseeing their digital modernization before this. Really thrilled to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for helping us move healthcare forward. I do work at Salesforce. It's a publicly traded company, so this is my favorite slide. So I have to put this forward. Salesforce just had its 20th birthday this year, and often people say to me, what is a doctor doing at Salesforce? And I asked the same question when I was thinking about the different companies. There are so many new entrants in the space. I think we heard from several folks from Google, and you've heard about Apple and all these folks. So Salesforce actually has been working with healthcare and life science customers in the consumer experience space for the last 20 years. We decided to have a dedicated vertical a few years ago because we realized that there is cross-industry transformation that is going on that we could bring to the healthcare space to elevate the consumer experience. So I'm really thrilled to be here and to give light and focus to the space at this wonderful company. So, I think we heard from a lot of speakers here today. Like, what an exciting time to be in healthcare in this era, in innovation. It's so exciting for me that I'm getting to see all of these things in my lifetime, right? Just think about where we were 10 years ago to where we are today. Healthcare, I think traditionally, I would say, has been very conservative, not only in its technology investments, but also in its adoption of technology. And for good reason. We're talking only about people's lives, right? So it's a little bit serious. So I think being thoughtful is not a bad thing, but I think we're at a time now where all of the cross-industry innovation is pushing healthcare to move along, and the technology on top of that has really improved and adds value. I think I heard someone saying if technology brings positive outcomes, then it actually makes it useful. So I think we're at the right time where the space is booming. I heard someone here say earlier that Rock Health put out an analysis on investments in this space for $8 billion in 2018. What was really interesting when I heard that is in 2017, that investment in digital tech was $5 billion. So that's a 46% increase in digital tech investments over the past year from 2017 to 2018. So you can see how excited the industry is to merge healthcare and technology. I think, to me, I hear about the emerging entrants, and I myself have been very skeptical for years because generally when you talk about healthcare, I go to conferences, people tell me how AI is going to move things. I think we heard talk about the robot doctor. The general AI, I think all of us in this room know that we're not there yet, right? We're talking about focused, narrow capabilities that are really making impact in specific areas right now. And I think we have to get that right, and we have to get all of these things right together in order for us to move to the general AI space. But I think there's no more interesting emerging technology that's been applicable in the healthcare space than AI, right? So there are applications in AI in this industry from medical diagnostics and imaging. We heard about therapeutics. So I think it's really interesting what AI is bringing to this. And like I said earlier, I think the emergence of this technology and the improvements on this technology, it's ripe for it to be integrated now into processes and making things more efficient. So I could go on and on for hours about AI, but I thought, I'm a doctor, so let me sort of talk about how do we apply this to outcomes and look at some practical applications. I'm a radiologist, and I'm really, really, really excited about this because I think there's a lot of discussions in the radiology community, specifically over the last couple of years, about AI, Is it going to replace doctors? Is it going to augment doctors? Like, what is it going to do, right? And I think radiologists were at the forefront in the digital era. And there's been a lot of innovation in our space because we were the first to digitize our technology. And I tell folks, I think we can help pave and guide the way for AI into healthcare to kind of show what are the appropriate uses. As I was thinking about this, I said, May is Stroke Awareness Month. So in light of that, I thought, let's talk about stroke and AI. Why is stroke, when a stroke occurs, why is that important? Because when a stroke occurs, every single minute counts. And every single minute counts because 2 million brain cells die every single minute that you don't restore blood flow back to the brain. When there is a stroke and a clot is blocking the blood flow to parts of your brain, the most effective way is to go in and to remove that clot. It is shown to be effective, efficient, and cost-effective. But in the US, as few as 1 in 10 patients actually receive this access and get this treatment in the United States. We're not talking about India, we're not talking about other parts of the country. This is in the United States. And to complicate things, a lot of stroke patients, when they come in and get a CAT scan, some of them may have blood in the brain, which complicates the treatment. It changes the course of treatment. So it's really critical to get the right imaging, the right reading, the right doctor, the right treatment at the right time, because you want to make sure that you prevent long-term disabilities or death in patients. I think in a lot of tech conferences we talk about the economic impacts. The economic impacts of misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis of brain bleed is $150,000 per person per year. But I think, and that's important, it's a huge cost to the healthcare system and we should talk about it. But the potential devastation to the patient's family that comes with that is at a much higher cost than the economic impact that we should remember. So we should remember why we're doing this. I think this is an incredible opportunity when a patient comes in. There are now pilots, research studies, folks at startups that are working with companies like GE and others that are bringing algorithms directly to the CAT scanners, adding chatbots to automate the findings of recognizing a brain bleed or a stroke on an angiogram, alerting the radiologist, perhaps via chatbots, to let them know that there's a potential imaging finding, and moving that imaging up the stack and streamlining the process so that they put it at the top of the stack. Now there's emerging entrants in this space that are also looking not only in the imaging space and the EHR data, but they're looking at other systems like who's on call, who's the appropriate doctor to be involved in this case, how serious is it? Is it a hemorrhagic stroke or is it an ischemic stroke? So that it alerts not only the radiologists, but the providers that are taking care of these patients. It'll alert the operating room. So I think there's really interesting use of this technology. I heard somebody say, I think within the last year, one of the fathers of AI, I think, that radiologists will get eliminated. I don't think so, not yet. If you look at AI applications in, let's say, aircraft, I keep hearing that a lot of AI is coming in to remove the manual processes in the cockpit. Planes pretty much can fly themselves. We've heard it again and again and again. I don't know how many of you are going to get into an aircraft to fly across the country with no pilots in the front. I think all I keep thinking about is when the plane needed to land on the Hudson River, we really needed Sully Sullenberger or so. I personally don't think that's happening anytime soon. Another interesting place where AI is being utilized is with mammography. Mammography is used to screen millions of women every year for breast cancer. It's pretty good technology, but it's not perfect. AI is bringing smarts to this technology. It is making it smarter. It is moving it from a one-size-fits-all read to a more personalized and targeted read. What does that mean? So Researchers at MIT joined together with radiologists at Mass General Hospital and developed an algorithm to apply to mammography to identify and characterize breast density. Why is that important? We heard about the FDA getting involved in everything. Well, just this year, Congress passed legislation in February saying that you have to have breast density measurements on every mammogram that is read. And the FDA is responsible for laying the minimum standard for it. Great, what's the problem? Well, the problem is breast density measurements on mammograms are really, really subjective. So it can vary by person. Dense breast tissue increases your chances of breast cancer, and there can be tumors that are hiding underneath the dense breast tissue. So these researchers took 10,000 cases, applied intelligence to it and algorithms, and had expert reads to see how they correlated. And what they found was 94% of the expert radiologists accepted the breast density measurements. So I thought that was incredible. There's also now other startups in the space that are looking at focused breast density measurements to say, here's an area of focused breast density. We have to evaluate this because of the higher risk of tumor. We recommend an ultrasound or an MRI or additional imaging to rule out tumors. So here's an interesting small study that was done. They looked at breast tissue on mammograms and looked at cancer detection, and what they found was without AI, 12 out of 24 patients had the diagnosis of cancer, but when AI was leveraged and harnessed in this, 22 out of the 24 patients, 22 of the 24 cancers were detected on the mammograms. I think this is pretty incredible. I mean, it's still very early stage. There's a lot of work to be done, but it's really promising. I think this is going to have a huge impact because we're talking about huge advancements in women's healthcare here. So I think that's a really incredible space. All right. I don't think, if any of you have lived here for the last few years, I think anybody who's a technologist knows about diabetic retinopathy and all of the talk about Google coming up with the algorithm and testing it. I think we heard about it again today. Well, I think what was historic was in 2018, the FDA took the historic step of approving a device that had an algorithm to analyze the back of the eye, the retina, to automate this process to diagnose diabetic retinopathy. There was no need for additional experts to review this once the machine reviewed the scan and spit out the diagnosis and gave a positive or negative. No additional experts were required. This is really incredible. Subsequent large studies after these medical device companies have made it into the United States, subsequent large studies have shown that the technology has gotten even better since 2018. In fact, it has shown that it has exceeded the benchmarks that was set by the FDA. That is really incredible. That's great, but what's the clinical implication of all of this? 30 million people live in the United States with diabetes. 7 million people out of the 30 million have diabetic retinopathy. Several of those folks go on to have vision loss. Half of the patients that have diabetes do not get eye exams. Half. Could be because they don't have access to transportation, could be they can't access care, perhaps they don't have insurance and don't have access to an ophthalmologist that can review the back of the eye for the highly specialized care that's needed. This medical device technology, automation algorithms, and FDA approval has now made it such that you are bringing highly specialized care that is readily accessible at a fraction of the cost to your local storefront. It can be sitting right next to your blood pressure cuff. Someone with diabetes can walk in to a grocery store or to your local pharmacy and have their eyes scanned and have a read that says you do or do not have diabetic retinopathy, because the leading cause of vision loss globally is diabetic retinopathy worldwide. So this is really incredible. Okay. Another really important focus. I was wondering if I should talk about this or not, but I think this is really, really important for us to talk about this. How do we use technology in mental and behavioral health? It was staggering to me to learn that there are 100,000 deaths by suicide every year globally, worldwide, right? That is 1 in every 40 seconds somebody dies by suicide. And our clinical methods of flagging risk factors for suicide are really just not there. It's a major challenge. It's really inaccurate. And more than half of the patients that die by suicide do not have mental health risk factors. So we're just not doing a good job, not because we don't have data or this or that, but we're not able to do it as humans. Here comes AI. Researchers and companies are coming together to pilot studies that are mining the EHR data to predict whether somebody has likelihood of suicide risk. And the results have been really encouraging. In one large study, it predicted over half of the patients that have suicidal behavior or ended up trying to commit suicide before they tried to harm themselves. That's pretty incredible, over half. This is really only the first step, because identifying it and saying somebody's at risk is great, but without bringing in clinical intervention, early clinical intervention, the right type of clinicians and the right type of support structure, you're really not going to get there. But really, really staggering, interesting results, and can be really impactful. That's great as a doctor. This was more interesting to me. There are several teams, even in the Bay Area, that are doing research on applying AI to teen suicide. Teen suicide is a second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 10 and 24. More teenagers and young adults die by suicide than cancer, AIDS, pneumonia, lung disease, heart disease, the flu, all combined. More die by suicide than all of those combined. So this is a really pressing public health issue, and we should be using technology to find out how we can help with this. One life is good enough for me. So instead of using EHR data, researchers are actually calling social media data to see what they can find to bring intelligence to predict, to detect early warning signs. Today, most teenagers spend more of their time on social media than they do probably with their parents, but definitely more with social media than they do with their hospitals or doctors or anywhere else. So this data is really rich with information. And it's ripe for investigation. But of course, when I say this, I think to myself, there are some really, really serious privacy concerns here, and there are some very serious ethical concerns here that we must discuss and think about. So AI is not, it's great that we can apply it, we can predict it, but how are we going to use it? So this technology is definitely not ready. It's not ready for clinical use, and it is not approved, but it is a really interesting space that I think we could be thinking about. Okay, so moving to something that's not related to clinical care. There are significant gains to be made with reducing costs in healthcare administration. Perhaps we can automate some of the highly repetitive tasks that are part of the healthcare system that are really routine. I think all of us have heard the number that 25% of the healthcare costs are due to administrative costs. Great. What does it mean for you and me? It means that for every $19,000 that we spend on US healthcare costs as an employee or as an employer towards family coverage, 5,700 of the 19,000 goes towards healthcare administration costs. Not towards your healthcare, but towards the actual administration of healthcare costs. So I thought a really important use case that I saw that was interesting was automating the medical coding and billing process. Medical coding and billing process outsourcing market is projected to reach $16.9 billion. This is a pretty large space. It's a really complex system of numbers and codes that they use when a patient goes in. They attach to the diagnosis of the patient's illness. They attach it to the procedures that the patient gets, and they put it all together. And the whole reason we do all of this is so that we can get reimbursed by the insurance companies. Great. But much of this work is manual. Much of this is done by the doctor. In some large places, they have coding and billing teams, but in many of the smaller practices and independent doctors' practices, this is done manually by doctors. So there are teams across the country that are using EHR data to see how they could streamline this process and apply intelligence to automatically generate these codes. This is great because it not only reduces healthcare costs, because we just talked about it, I think that's really important, but to me, as a clinician, I'm like, get those doctors out of the coding business and get them back to seeing patients, right? Like, that's what we are all supposed to be doing as much as we can. I still see patients. So I think that's really, important. It's great for the provider, it's great for the payer, it's great for the healthcare administrator, but for you and I as healthcare consumers and patients, this is really, really, really important. To shift gears, let's quickly touch base on blockchain. I think when we hear the word blockchain, like all the financial services people stand up and talk about cryptocurrency. That's awesome. But there are also tons of folks talking about this in the healthcare space. I think it's really early, but it's interesting technology. There are several business cases that have come to play, particularly where there's concerns about data integrity and data validity and security. I think blockchain can be really useful. So a couple of quick use cases. Let's talk about the pharmacy supply chain. There are several companies that are looking at applying blockchain to the pharmacy supply chain to follow the life cycle of a drug from when it's made to as it's tracked through the distributors to the pharmacists to as it gets dispensed. Why is it important? How about counterfeit medication? There's a significant amount of counterfeit drugs that come through the system. You and I don't want to be taking something that's counterfeit. Ideally, you'd want to take something, and if we had a way to trace and track those medications to say, here's the life cycle of this particular medicine that came through, and I know it's legit, that's important. An even more interesting use case is perhaps in opioids, applying this to the opioid life cycle. Much of the opioid prescriptions in this country are written on paper, and there's a number, and when you go to the pharmacy to fill your opioid prescriptions, the pharmacist takes the prescription and gives you the opioid. Well, there are several cases where this prescription gets replicated somehow and gets reused again and again with the same number. Imagine if we could apply that prescription number and apply a timestamp to it to when it was dispensed, so when it tries to get filled again, you now have a ledger that says this was already filled day before yesterday, right? That's really interesting. Another really interesting use case I saw was the Department of Defense is now trying to pilot this for the use in logistics. So in large efforts where they have relief efforts, like for hurricanes, where they send out medical help, they are tracking each of those incidents and collaborating across different systems by leveraging blockchain. So another really interesting use. We have several others, physician credentialing. We could think about perhaps consent management. I heard one recently where there's a startup that is looking to follow the life cycle of a claim. So as soon as the claim gets submitted and it's the remit of the claim, the provider gets paid, there's a co-pay component, and the patient gets paid. It is a complete life cycle of a claim, and you can track it in the same way like you can a pharmaceutical. So I think there are plenty of use cases. I think the issue with blockchain is it's still really early, and like with everything else in healthcare technology, are we going to adopt it in healthcare? Are people going to buy into it? I think that's more interesting. So before I get done, I want to quickly hit on another technology in healthcare, virtual reality. I think we saw stuff earlier with people moving, opening the body and doing pre-surgical planning. I think it's really interesting. So a lot of use cases in medical training, right? Why is that important? Because you can train at scale. I think it's also interesting to use it in like rare diseases because you don't come across those things all the time in medical training. So if you can put rare disease treatment and surgical planning into this, you can replicate this and use it many times at scale. So that's really interesting. there's a local Bay Area company that's actually using their VR platform, and they've put it into 30 different hospitals, and they're using it and testing it in things like pain management. So pain management in moms that are giving birth, pain management in chemotherapy patients. They are also using it to alleviate anxiety in young kids that are going into surgery. So I thought that was a really interesting use case. And they're also looking at using VR for patients with autism. So bringing real world experiences that they can experience and go through with no risk and no worry of any sort of a failure. So I thought that was really interesting to give the opportunity to help with autism. So I think this is really exciting. Again, a lot of these applications are transforming healthcare right before our eyes. We may see that it is incremental change, but I think that's going to drastically change over the next 10 years. I am really, really excited to be a clinician. I'm really excited to be in healthcare. I'm excited to be in healthcare tech. I'm excited to see all of the different investments that come through and evaluate it in the role that I'm in to work with all of you. I think I heard this again and again, that no technology is successful without partnerships. No company, particularly outside companies like Google or Apple or Salesforce, will be successful without partnerships with all of you. So I think it's really important that we work together, partner with companies, partner with investors, partner with entrepreneurs, and partner with the folks that are going to be using it, and perhaps even patients, to actually make this useful technology. So really excited to be here. Just wanted to say thank you for having me, and thank you for staying and listening.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. It's very insightful. So I have a question regarding AI in radiology, right up your alley. So we heard during several panels today that AI is all about data, data, otherwise garbage in, garbage out. So, and IBM, as you very well know, a few years ago, they bought Merge Healthcare to get access to those treasure of medical imaging. So what do you see? How do companies like Salesforce and other folks trying to do something AI in radiology get access to that treasure trove of images? I mean, VA has a lot of those.
Yep.
CMS. And how do we get around the privacy issues?
So I think just like getting access to EHR data, getting access to imaging data and mining it is important. Salesforce is not in the business of doing AI related to imaging specifically, but we are looking at applications to see how can we look at the data that's available in partnership with the providers and the patients to see how we can gain insights that we can help with outcomes. So I'll give you an example of something that would be interesting in the EHR data, in particular with the VA. VA has a significantly high population of homeless people, and there's a very serious access crisis that happened in 2014 at the VA that led to all of the conversations around patient access. Well, if you can utilize the data that's available about a patient and their social determinants of health to say this person is likely going to be a no-show, or there's a 20% possibility that this person's going to show, you can potentially improve the access by adding on more patients to the roster. Or when you have a patient in-house and you're trying to get them out, if you realize that they're less likely to come back, you're going to try to get a more holistic care process for them before they leave the system so that you can decrease readmissions, right? So I think that's really important. In imaging particularly, I think, like I said, we are looking at technology to sort of placing intelligence in terms of reading the images and having insights. But I don't think we're there to replace the clinician. So I think you need to look at the data in conjunction with the EHR data, in conjunction with all of the other data that's available to have a conversation about what those insights mean. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Ash, I loved the possibilities that you talked about. Really good. Very inspirational. I wanted to touch upon one topic around mental and behavioral health. It's near and dear to me, as it is to you and others. It's a national problem, and part of the challenge that we see is, whether it be pediatric psychiatry or other mental behavioral issues, it is really hard to get appointments, especially if you go to an organization like Kaiser, which is where I come from. We often have to partner with external partners to be able to provide that care. And sometimes mothers of these kids have to wait 3 to 6 months before they can get an appointment. And even then, there's such administrative burden between the entities to share information, whether it be eligibility, whether it be claims. You talked about that as well. It's a big, big challenge for us. And I don't think that any one healthcare organization is going to be able to fix it. We absolutely need a third-party partner, a CRM, if you will, that can help us bridge that gap. So could you share a little bit about what Salesforce is doing in that space?
Yeah, recently we announced that we've sort of looked at the, not just specific to mental and behavioral health, but in general with social determinants of health. How can we bring that insight and information to the care management team to better take care of the patients, right? Like I said earlier, whether you take care of them while they're in-house, or can you help the provider systems give them access to telemedicine or care outside? I think there are several interesting companies that are working with healthcare systems, like Wobot, that are looking to bring chatbots into a space like this, right? So. What they're saying is that cognitive behavioral therapy specifically can be much more automated and rules-based, and you can bring in that process at large. A lot of pros and cons. I think when you're talking about behavioral health and you're talking about automation and chatbots or use of telemedicine, people kind of squirm a little bit because there's a broad spectrum. Do you have a patient that is having suicidal ideation that's 3,000 miles away? How do you deal with that? Who do you need in-house? What kind of folks do you need for telemedicine? Is a chatbot going to kind of calm them down? I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think it's really interesting technology. What I will say is, if you are living in a rural area and you don't have access to your care provider, or traditionally the way care is delivered right now, for, let's say, psychiatrists, it's based on like a once in a month or once every 2 weeks scheduled appointment. It's not ad hoc as needed PRN, right? So what this brings is something when you need it. So if someone wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning and has anxiety, they don't have somebody to call on that's a professional. Perhaps this device will at least get them to a state where they're calm enough that they can call on a provider. Of course, if it's really serious, I always recommend to go to the local ER urgent care. But I think there are use cases that's useful. I think we have to be mindful on whether we are removing the intimacy and the humanity when we're talking about behavioral health. Like I said, there are lots of companies working on this, really interesting technology. Artificial intelligence is really important. But we don't want to have, I think I heard somebody say recently that you don't want to have that become artificial intimacy. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, particularly with behavioral health.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. I'm Karnveer. I run a company called Atharva Marcom, and we are a media company. And we had a client which is a school, which is one of the largest schools in India, and they have around 400,000 students. And every year, the suicide problem was very massive. They were having some 10 suicides a year because of the pressure, of exams and all that kind of thing like you have in India. So through our management and information management, we actually last year reduced that to 0. I don't know if it was how much due to our intervention of the right information going in, but AI, I was really impressed with what you said. But one of the things which is a concern in AI, which I don't know if you dwelt on, is a confidentiality, and what kind of information is being collected and that kind of thing. Because the more and more AI we begin to introduce, and the more and more monitoring we are doing of information, the more suspicion there is in the minds of parents and all the entities involved, that they don't want this information collected. So there's a lot of suspicion. I don't know how you want to handle that.
So I think, again, when you're talking about healthcare, it's a lot more serious, and we have to give this and be more thoughtful. I think when the YouTube engineers thought about putting in AI to generate what patients would like to see next, they weren't thinking about the ramifications, but there are now whistleblowers and centers that are being formed on the ethical use and humane use of AI, right? There are lots of kids that are clicking on, let's say, Googling YouTube for like suicide or whatever, and the next one that shows up is a 9/11 video, and the next one that shows up is, something that's more extreme, because what they realize is that's what keeps people's interests going down that path, and there are algorithms that have like machine learning that has like learned and said, here's the right way to do it. But I don't think the engineers that were doing it were thinking about the other ramifications, right? And that's not their job. There are other people that should be working in those companies, and we as a society should be talking about it. I think I agree with you. I think because of what we're seeing now with this intelligence that's coming in through other areas, not just in healthcare, it is leading to other behaviors, right? So leading to depression, leading to extremism, leading to increasing other risks, let's say. So I think you will definitely have more regulation, whether you're talking about medical device AI technology, whether you're talking about pharma with FDA coming in, Congress passing laws saying you must do this and that, and having mandating FDA to do things. I think we're going to have a lot more conversation on regulation. But I think we as entrepreneurs and people in technology and healthcare, particularly living in the Bay Area, should be considering this. Every time we come up with something, we should say, what is the positive and what's the negative? What is the bias here, and how do we think about this in terms of a ramification? Great, this is going to make money, but what is the larger application of this? And particularly when you're an investor or somebody who's in a provider system or a payer system, you are obligated to think through these things. I think it rests with all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.